everyone. This is Politico Live. I'm Leonie Cater, a tech reporter at Politico. Welcome to what's bound to be an interesting conversation on how policymakers can best monitor AI implementation and impact. Today, our speakers are Christina Montgomery, IBM's Vice President and Chief Privacy Officer. We also have Benoit Rottenborg, the lead who's leading the Regalia project for the National Institute for Research in Digital Science and Technology in France. We also have Matthias Spielkamp, the Executive Director of Algorithm Watch, and Andrew Wyckoff, Director for Science, Technology and Innovation at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Thank you all so much for joining us. I thought we'd start with the general question. What do we think of the one-size-fits-all framework for an AI audit? Is that at all realistic? And if not, why not? Christina, what do you make of the starting question?
So there's absolutely a role for auditable impact assessments, and these would ideally be formed based on consensus-based, globally recognized standards. And at IBM, we've been advocating for this approach for more than a year through our precision regulation approach to AI. So in that context, we envision an initial risk assessment that assesses the potential for harm based on the use of a system, and then a more robust risk assessment for high-risk systems that would be auditable and detailed. We also believe that more needs to be done to monitor for bias and impact, especially on marginalized groups. So we've called for things like more funding for AI test beds with minority serving institutions at the table to help in that development and to ensure diversity at all stages of the development, deployment, use of AI. The key here with all of these frameworks is to build trust by operationalizing AI ethics principles and ensuring appropriate governance is in place to provide ongoing review and oversight of systems. And with the right safeguards, AI has huge transformative potential, but that's why we're really calling for a pragmatic approach to impact assessments that are auditable and formed on consensus-based, globally recognized standards.
So no to one-size-fits-all.
Essentially, yes, but with, so not every system, low risk, high risk, there needs to be some initial vetting to assess for potential harm before a detailed auditable impact assessment. That's our vision.
Great. And Matthias, what do you make of this, and what do you make of Christina's take?
Yeah, I guess many people will be surprised that I'd say we agree very much on what she just said. Because, we are a non-governmental advocacy organization, and of course, we consider ourselves a watchdog of these processes. But I do think that there is an aspect of doing both at the same time. So the one-size-fits-all approach, as you call it, is actually the approach that there needs to be a generalized impact assessment. Generalized in the sense there needs to be an impact assessment that is applied to all these different systems. But I agree with Christina that the approach should be that we have a low threshold first level impact assessment, whatever you want to call it. We ourselves call it an ADMS triage. ADMS here stands for Automate Decision-Making Systems, because this is the framework that we prefer over artificial intelligence, because it explains a little better what we are worried about. But if you have this ADMS triage, then you can find out whether there is actually a risk that is implied in the deployment and use of a certain system. And then if that is the case, we can go deeper. And as I said, the one-size-fits-all approach here is that this needs to be applied across the board. Whereas what we have at the moment is the suggestion that there are some systems that don't need this kind of risk assessment at all. And this is something that we don't agree with.
Okay, great. And Andy, what makes for a a good algorithm auditing framework, in your opinion?
Well, good morning to everyone. And I guess for us, it means looking at each stage of the AI system through its whole life cycle. And as we look at this and some of our work has analyzed this, we see 6 different stages. The first being planning and design, second being data collection and processing, third being building of the model and its interpretation, fourth then being verification and validation, fifth being deployment, and sixth being the operation and monitoring. And we think at each phase, you need to do an assessment of the various risks for things that Christina and Matthias have already mentioned, things like fairness, privacy, and transparency, and explainability. And following the risk assessment, following this assessment, we think that the idea of interjecting a risk mitigation measure should be put in place for the issues we've just identified. We're trying to build a database of various tools that help AI address some of these issues, including some of the tools that actually IBM has developed. And lastly, just 2 points here about the auditing framework. I think you need to assure that these various measures are being met, and then factor in something, because we know AI systems will evolve over time. They're not going to stay set in one place, and so we need to determine an optimal auditing frequency.
Okay, great. And Benoit, your thoughts?
I really think it's important to have this notion of life cycle and continuous evolution of those systems. If you take a recommendation algorithm, like the one you have in TikTok or YouTube, or your favorite, I don't know, Netflix system, these algorithms evolve with us. So it's not 100% artificial intelligence, it's a decision system that is progressing with us, along us. The more we describe what we need, the more they evolve and give us maybe what we need, what we want, or maybe what the company, what the economic interest of the company want. And I think watching that, auditing that, in order to be efficient in this process, we need to have a kind of continuous effort and not a one-shot questionnaire or one-shot study. So for me, a quality of a good auditing system, if we take the recommendation algorithms I mentioned before, has to be continuous, exactly like drug tests. You don't do a drug test once in a year. You have to do it in a continuous mode to be efficient, to see discrepancies, to see a new doping technique. I don't know. So like doping test, we have to inject and probe the system in a continuous, hence efficient manner.
Okay. So what do you make of, so it seems the EU in their upcoming AI regulation believes that ex-ante conformity assessments, so before these products go to market, is the way to go, as they see that AI auditing expertise is only now being accumulated. So we're still pretty early on there. Is that something that you would disagree with then, Benoit?
Yes, I think it's a mix. We need to force a little bit companies to think about the consequences, I don't know, discrimination, unfairness, etc. We have to force the companies to introduce those mechanisms in their production systems. Call it compliance, like a compliance for the banks. So we need to introduce a compliance notion into the process first. But second, as we say in French, trust doesn't prevent control. So maybe we trust them, but we know perfectly that each one of the big platform has sometimes been disloyal by design or by accident. So we need to put control in place, and these control mechanisms has to be, let's say, pragmatic, evolutive, and of course, accurate. But it doesn't make sense elsewhere.
Okay. And Christina, what do you make of Benoit's take?
Well, I completely agree with that. I mean, I think any good auditable impact assessment, auditable framework should really, the key goal is, right, to build trust, to promote trust through accountability and fairness. And so I look at it as three components. I completely agree with the life cycle approach. I think that, again, coming back to what I said earlier about looking at the risk of harm, I think that there should be the promotion of robust accountability proportional to the risk, and the role of the party who's best placed to address the risk at any given point in time, coming back to the life cycle comment that Benoit made. I also think it needs to be flexible and outcome-based so that it can be integrated into the operational controls at a company. There are many stakeholders across companies throughout the life cycle of the design, development, deployment, sale, and then use of AI, and any framework should really take all of that into account. And again, coming back to a point I made earlier as well, I think it really should be interoperable and based on a globally recognized standards in some sense, right? Because we really want to facilitate compliance and responsible data management, as well as advanced privacy protection, privacy protecting cross-border data flows, which are really critical for a global economy. So interoperability as much as possible is also important.
And you spoke there about global standards. Do you believe that the EU is setting a global standard with its regulations? Is that what we're looking at here?
We think ultimately, there will be. I mean, we are supportive of work that's being done to develop rules of the road in various levels at the individual nations, right? So in the US, the NIST AI risk management framework, supranational bodies like the EU AI regulation and what comes out of that, and among international organizations as well, like IEEE and ISO and the OECD and the high-level expert group. So I think that, we're involved in all those aspects.
Okay. And Andrew, what do you make of this? Are we looking at are they setting the global standards here, the EU, or what are your thoughts?
I am very happy that the EU started the conversation going across the globe with their proposed AI regulations. And they've built in a number of mechanisms there that will allow feedback and change over the 2-year process. And so we'll see where it ends up. As Christina has suggested, there are other countries who are beginning to move on this as well. The United States is one of them with NIST. In their work, recent executive order by President Biden on the use of public procurement as a tool to guide where AI is going and ensure it's responsible. We're working with the Canadians, who actually have an audit system beginning to be deployed as well. So I think at the end of the day, what we're going to have to look at is to ensure that there are a lot of learning and idea sharing across the globe, particularly amongst those countries that kind of have a common view on how AI should go, and trying to start out from the beginning at making sure these things are interoperable, because this is inherently a global technology that will move across borders very easily.
Okay, interesting. And let's go to Benoit. How should data and security issues be tackled at the European and national level? And on this subject, who should be responsible?
It's a very complex topic. And here again, I will take the voice of pragmatism first. If you have a bottleneck, if you have one central place that is studying everything, you take the risk of bottleneck. But also, if you are too local, it can be extremely painful for every company to have to comply to every local rule. So I think it's a compromise we have to imagine. Probably groups of regulators sharing technologies, for instance. We can imagine research centers plus regulators making some shared environment or sandboxes to prepare audit systems. So I can imagine a kind of alliance of local regulators when it can be efficient, like what we have for GDPR, or like we have for some notions. It has to be locally efficient, but probably a bit standardized and mutualized at a higher level.
Okay. Matthias, what are your thoughts?
Well, I agree again, but I would also like to come back to a different thought, and that is about that conformity assessment aspect of it and whether this is possible and realistic. And I think what sort of gets forgotten a little bit in that discussion, I think it's a tremendously important discussion. It's very, very difficult to come up with a generalized conformity assessment for artificial intelligence, because the systems that we are talking about have such a wide range and so many different purposes, and they use so many different technologies. So that's going to be a challenge. And I think what we need to do is not lose sight of the question of what do we want to use these systems for? Because this idea of conformity assessment usually starts when you have decided that you would like to use a system for a certain purpose. And I'll give you the example of facial recognition, because it is one of the most contested examples and or cases, and I think it's a very good one, because you could argue that the conformity assessment is there, let's say, to make sure that there is no discrimination between different ethnicities, let's say. So dark faces should be recognized with the same accuracy as light faces. And that, of course, needs to be true. But at the same time, if these systems are used for indiscriminatory live surveillance of people in, for example, public places, then it's something that we cannot agree to. So the conformity assessment is not really addressing the right question here. The question is, should we use these systems for these purposes? And that is something that we need to discuss more. And at the same time, of course, think about how we can test the systems for accuracy and security and so on and so forth. But it's really important not to focus on that, but to keep asking the question, is the system fit for purpose? Do we want to use it for that? Instead of, for example, also creating an infrastructure of power, especially by very, very large companies who are providing these systems that we then later on cannot escape.
Okay. And Andrew, what do you make of what we've just heard?
Yeah, no, I actually, an analogy that comes to mind is that in the mid-1700s, we didn't really have a classification for animals into genus and species. And this came forward from a Swedish botanist. And I think we're at the same stage with AI. There are many different things, and we need to figure out a classification scheme for how best to separate those that are benign from those that are more risky, as Matthias has just said. And we're working on such a system. We just very quickly with 4 components. That one looks at the context environment. Is this about a Netflix recommendation, or is it a healthcare decision? These are very different things. The second is, what's the data that the model's being trained on? Where's it coming from in terms of that environment? Third is that technology is used in the AI model, both the model type, but it's also the training process and related properties that Christina's talked about in terms of robustness and explainability and bias. And fourth, it's what Matthias was just talking about. How is that task, how's that AI system going to be used back into that environment, whether it be a recommendation engine or personalization or whatever. And we're building out this classification with that expert group that Christina referred to. We hope that this not only helps with different types of risk measures, but helps with that interoperability question that I think we're going to face between countries with different pieces of legislation.
Okay. We're getting a few questions in from the audience, and that's actually a quick reminder. Don't forget to submit questions via the Swap Card app in the questions box next to the live stream to our audience. You can already answer our poll, which has the question: if you had to choose just one, which feature would make an algorithm auditing framework good? You can also tweet about this event with our hashtag #PoliticoAI. We've got one question, for example, from Philippe Van Triel. He says, the panelists use very consensual terms, but as they speak about low and high risk systems, can they be more specific on what the criteria, what are the criteria for making the difference? If we could go to Benoit to start with.
This is not the easiest question. The taxonomy of all those applications is extremely unstable and very large. But let's be concrete. A recommendation algorithm is one example. A pricing algorithm can be another one. So if you look at pricing, what do you want and what don't you want? Maybe you want to accept the idea of a price that changes with time, a price that is a little bit segmented towards a category of population. But what you don't want is a price that is completely personalized and exploits the fact that you have been coming 3 times on the website, and at the 4th session, your price increase to give you some urgency feeling so that you book and you pay a higher price. So this kind of manipulation is a little risk. It's not a big risk. It's not a vehicle killing people, but it's a risk that happens 100 times a day for you and me. Every time we look at a website, we see a price because we buy almost every week, I think, in average. So we have to make the difference not only in terms of level of risk, killing people or not killing people, but also the frequency of those little manipulations. And the law protects us against manipulations. So for me, this kind of fraud, or let's say cheating systems, has to be controlled. It's little AI, it's not a big AI, it's not Terminator. It's something quite simple, but extremely efficient, and with an impact that is a daily impact for every one of us.
Okay. And Christina, your take on Philippe's question?
So I would go back to some of the points that were made earlier about an AI framework and the components that it should have. So I think it's very important to look at things like the context and the use. And I completely agree with Philippe's comments as well. And it is very nuanced, but there are some clear cases. And the EU regulation has done a good job, I think, of breaking out some of those completely unacceptable high-risk uses, like facial recognition for mass surveillance or racial profiling, or areas like social scoring that violate basic human rights. These are really, really clear in terms of their impact. But you also need to look at things like the number of people that will be affected by a high-risk system. How automated is it? Is there any human oversight or human involvement? And again, the types of decisions that it's making and impacting. Price is a great example. Then there are some really more like helping you select, for example, a chatbot that helps you select an article of clothing, for example. So in those cases, you know, IBM's position is that you should always know when you're interacting with an AI system, but there's some obviously lower risk versus higher risk situations.
In fact, IBM announced last year that it was going to stop selling facial recognition technology. Is that correct, Christina?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we announced last year that we do not develop, sell any general purpose AI facial recognition software. We sunset all our technology in that area.
And is that something you'd like companies globally to follow suit on?
We did call on others to do that until the technology can get better and we can have well-defined rules around it. We've also been very clear that, we, again, completely agree with the position that came out of, and that's in the proposed EU regulatory framework regarding facial recognition for mass surveillance. That it's just unacceptable across the board.
Great. Another question that's getting a lot of votes on our live discussion is from Barry Scannell. He asked, from a music industry perspective, it is extremely difficult to provide licenses to AI systems exploiting copyright works without knowledge of the training sets being used, etc. Should training sets used to train AI be made available publicly? I wonder, Andrew, do you have a reply you'd like to share with us on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it goes back to this life cycle analysis we've been talking about, is that the training data really matters. And I'm come at this both ways. Yes, I think this should be a public infrastructure in some cases. And we've seen some facial recognition, for example, early image sets, curated training data being made publicly available so that others could train their AI systems on this data. But on the other hand, I think you're going to quickly run into intellectual property issues where some firms see this as a strategic asset and one which gives them value, and they're competing in the marketplace, and they're not going to be too keen to just hand that over in every case. So I think that you're probably going to have to go forward with a mix of public and private.
Okay. Matthias, what would you have to say?
I think it's a great example of what we discussed before, because there is no clear answer to that, because it depends on what you want to do with the data that you're using, what systems are to be trained, and what kind of risk, for example, they present. So I can easily imagine that in some cases, an assessment comes to the conclusion that, yes, in this case, we need to see what the data set looks like that this system was trained on, because we would like to prevent that there are certain outcomes. I mean, I don't want to use these examples of discrimination over and over again, but of course it is a very important risk that is present here. And then, it depends on what we are talking about. It depends on the system. So again, if we argue that like the recommendation system in Netflix is not as important as the one that is used in YouTube, because that platform is used for by many more people to also inform themselves about current events and look into political discussions than that is the case on Netflix, then we could, for example, argue that we need to have a higher level of transparency and data access into the data sets that are used for training the YouTube recommender systems than we would like to see for Netflix. But if we come to a different assessment, then that could change. And it's not really possible to say this before the fact. So I would just argue that this is exactly the reason why we think there needs to be this tiered approach of finding out first what is the impact, what is the purpose of the system, and what will it do to society and individuals, and then decide what measures to take. And these, of course, need to be enforceable. So, if companies don't want to share this because of intellectual property issues, this is a high hurdle, but we cannot accept that, for example, as an excuse for every single purpose or system that we are discussing. Just think about, for example, automated weapons. We are not going to take this as a no if a private company says, yeah, leaving aside the question of whether to use that at all, but just imagine that there's a company that works together with the government to develop such a thing, and they say, yeah, but we're not going to let you look into our data set because this is intellectual property and we have trade secrets here. That would be entirely unacceptable.
Okay. I guess another question in that vein, that there's some concern that AI auditing ends up legitimizing potentially harmful technologies and uses of AI. Would you say that this is a fair assessment, and do you think the EU proposal goes away to addressing this? Benoit, what would you make of that?
Oh, sorry, can you repeat the question? I missed the first sentence.
There's some concern that AI audits end up legitimizing potentially harmful technologies and uses of AI. Would you say that that's fair? And do you think the EU proposal goes away towards addressing that?
I think when you audit a system, you cannot use any kind of technique to audit. You have to respect many rules. And for instance, if I want to audit anti-terrorist curation in YouTube, I cannot generate terrorist content just to check that YouTube is curating correctly. So it's an example of the fact that when you audit, you have to have a certain kind of behavior. You have to be accessible, you have to show what you're doing, you have to prove what you're doing, and you cannot, I think, harm globally the system you're auditing. I think it's one element. But there is another element. On the contrary, if you have in mind the Dieselgate, Volkswagen, for CO2 emissions, I mean, when you audit a system, the system might know it is being audited. So if you audit, let's say, stupidly a system, the system knows it's been audited and can cheat. So in order to make a valid audit, you have to make this audit really significant and of course, bypass a little bit of the mechanisms of protection that a system can have, which was the case for Volkswagen, but it's a case for Spotify or Deezer. They are used to detect robots. So if you audit Deezer or Spotify with a robot, they know it's a robot that is auditing them.
Okay, great. We're getting some good audience questions in. Thanks a lot, everyone. We've got another one from Leonard Van Rompuy. He says, we've been hearing a lot about AI as software, Netflix, discrimination, etc. But what about AI systems that are used in collaborative robotics, autonomous cars, etc.? How would you go about monitoring the use and impact of AI systems embedded in machinery? Andrew, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I would go back to this classification that I was talking about in the life cycle. Again, there can be many different types of AI in automated vehicles. I was on a panel last week. I mean, everything from assisted driving now, which is relatively benign and where a lot of the data in the AI stays within the car, to what we envision as truly level 5, truly fully automated data. And that's where you're going to have to be sharing data much more robustly. And so I guess it's an issue of looking at each stage, where the data is coming from, how it's being used, what will be the context of it being applied. And I think we have to really improve our definitions and nuance of what we mean by AI. It is not going to just be one monolithic entity, as we've been discussing through this panel. It's going to be, thousands of different types of AI, and we need to get, I think, more sophisticated at how we treat those. And so real-world applications and sandboxes like these automated vehicles, I think, will help us develop that capability.
Okay. Matthias, what are your thoughts on the same question?
Well, I think it comes back to the, as Andrew said, to the discussion that we had before. We need to take a holistic approach here. We are talking about these systems as socio-technical systems. That means that they are embedded in a context. And then, of course, what context that is and how embedded they are and what, action they take, whatever, depends on the system. So I wouldn't even make a difference between an AI system and an AI system that is used in robotics. It is still a system that would that would be subject to the EU regulation, for example, and to the auditing mechanisms that we have been talking about. So same is true for, first of all, assessing what is the purpose. Can we, is it meaningful to use it? Is it going to be benevolent, or is it going to be harmful? And this we have to do with the look at the, or a view of the entire system we are talking about. So to me, it doesn't make too much sense to differentiate between these different kinds of systems, because we already now have systems that use the intake of sensors very much, and not just in robotics, but coming back to this discussion about, or the example of face recognition, it also uses sensors. I mean, it wouldn't work without it. So to make a distinction here between the software part of it and then how it interacts with the world doesn't make too much sense to me. And we should not, let's say, use this approach when addressing the use of these AI systems.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question about conformity assessments from Vanya Skorik, who asks, any conformity assessment needs to include human rights impact assessment to have a human-centric AI, and be compliant with EU Charter on Human Rights. How should the EU Commission ensure that? Christina, what do you make of this question?
So I think that's absolutely right. And I think that the focus that the EU proposed framework has on high impact assessments that are essentially looking at, and the classification of risk, which is looking at fundamental rights and impact, such as safety and health, those are the systems that the EU is looking to regulate. So I think it's captured within the high-level overview of the framework really quite well. And I think that the nuances of it, the aspects of it, will come out as the conformity assessments are hopefully standardized to address the regulation.
Okay, great. Matthias, what are your thoughts? Sorry.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'm still grappling with that, whether we really have a conflict here, in the sense that, does the EU regulation, the proposed regulation, really not address that adequately? And I'm not saying it does. I'm saying, I'm still trying to come to terms with how to assess this. So I think it's a very, very relevant question. But what we argue is that, and this comes back to another question that was asked before, what kind of impact assessment we should have. And this should address the system on a very high level, but in a very pragmatic way. What does that mean? How do these two things come together? Because when we argue that there needs to be this ADMS triage, finding out, does it present a risk or not, we are looking at values that are harm prevention, autonomy, justice and fairness, and beneficence of such systems. And if you look at these values and then try to determine whether there is a risk of, for example, harm, or there is a risk of not being just or fair, or rather infringing on justice and fairness ideas that we share as a society, then to me, it's completely natural that the question of fundamental rights and human rights come into play. Because if you have a system that infringe on these values, I mean, it's pretty clear that this is covered. So this is why I am arguing that we can make it happen, that the two things come together, that it's not just looking at this from, let's say, a consumer protection point of view, but it does address these fundamental rights questions, which we necessarily have to do. And if we can do this with this assessment that is very fundamental, but also pragmatic, and then provide a lot of transparency and accountability, I think we are on the right track. Let's see how we can, or whether we can make it happen.
Great. I'd be keen to hear your thoughts as well, actually, Andrew.
Yeah, no, thanks. We put out some principles on AI in 2019 that were fundamentally about this approach, being human-centric and really protecting human rights, because we just saw these as being fundamental to getting adoption and benefiting from, I think, a lot of the opportunities that come with AI. But then the question is, how do you back up these nice principles, which have been adopted now by 50 different countries, with implementation? And this is where we're going now. And what we're doing is we're getting experts together. We're using our committee process, and we're beginning this implementation exercise, which looks not only at different policies in different countries so that we can learn from each other, but about some of the tools that Christina and others were talking about earlier that can help detect bias in data sets and so forth. And we're trying to compile all this on the OECD.ai Observatory, which I recommend people going to. But I think this is the phase we're going to be involved in, and it's going to take trial and error to get it right on how to preserve these. But I just think we need to be diligent, and it's panels like this, but it's also raising the awareness amongst policymakers, which I think is happening, that this needs to be front and center right now, and get the attention it deserves as many of these systems get deployed.
Okay, thank you. And then Benoit also.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, the devil is in the details. So it's extremely difficult beforehand, ex ante, to imagine all the potential cases against violating some human rights or some human values. It's extremely difficult. I would like to give one very simple example. As you know, the billboards, the little billboards on Netflix that you see and you can click on to see the film or the series. There has been a little scandal I think it's a few months ago, about these billboards. It's an algorithm who is not only ranking the films for you, but there is another algorithm who is choosing the right billboard. So for instance, if you look at Wonder Woman, you will have a billboard with Gal Gadot in front of you, or if you maybe you will have another billboard with a male character. And the scandal occurred because we saw that some Afro-American communities were shown billboards with black actors, because the likelihood that they would choose this film was higher if there was a black character in the billboard. So you see, something that is efficient suddenly becomes a little bit more, we don't feel at ease with that. If it's a minor character, it's not typical of the film. And then you see something that is not typical at all of the film. But, and that's why I would like to insist on this point, it's also cultural. We are a little bit responsible for that. If we choose characters of our own community, the algorithms will learn it. So not only we have to show what these algorithms are doing, but we have also to not educate, maybe it's a too big word, but we have to explain the consequences of our own choices. When we click on some kind of videos, on some kind of pictures, we are giving something to the algorithms. So I think there is also education that goes with it. It's not only a matter of audit or a matter of compliance, it's also a matter of educating us on our behavior in front of those decision systems, so that we gain a little bit back some power, I would say, against the machines.
Great, thank you very much. We have 30 seconds left. I'm not sure if we have any more time for any more questions. But I just wanted to finish off by saying this has been a very interesting conversation, and very happy to have taken part in it. And thank you so much to our speakers for joining us. Yes, thank you for attending. And also, please join my colleague Lawrence for our next session in a couple of minutes as he unpacks the subject of fundamental rights in AI use with a panel of expert speakers. Please stay tuned. Thanks again, everyone.